Welcome to the Data Product Management in Action podcast, created and executive produced by me, Scott Hirleman, and brought to you by Soda, your best friend in data quality and contracts tooling. We created this podcast to serve as a place for actual practitioners bringing product management practices to data, whether that is to AI and ML, data products, platforms, or everything else in data, right? And it's to dig into the nitty-gritty of product management in data, but in fun and dynamic conversations. It's not just lift and shift from software product management. We have a great set of hosts for you that are also practitioners, so they can really get into those specifics and dive deep and get you the information you want to know rather than just high level, here is what a data product is. This is about cutting through the noise of data product management to drive towards actionable insights, hence the actual podcast name, Data Product Management in Action. So sit back and enjoy another awesome conversation.
Hey everyone, it's Michael Toland here with the Data Product Management in Action podcast. I'm thrilled to be joined by someone that I think folks in the data mesh community, particularly those within the data mesh learning group, know very well. He currently works for the ACA group. I would love to welcome Tom DeWolf. Tom, welcome to Data Product Management in Action. A mouthful every time I say it.
Hi, Michael. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. If you could go ahead and just give an introduction to our audience about your work, what you're doing right now, and a little bit about your background and how you got into sort of data mesh, data products.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm Tom DeWolf, and my background is actually a software engineer, software architect, almost already working 16, 17 years for ACA Group. Before that, I did a PhD in distributed systems, actually around multi-agent systems. So that's coming back as a buzzword these days. And about 4 years ago, I devoted my time full-time to data mesh as an innovation track. With my architect background, of course, the principle of self-serve platform and engineering such a platform has my interest. But also doing more general data mesh consultancy, management consultancy, technical, all the way to the principles of governance and decentralized ownership.
Yeah. And right now, I think it's just a really huge part as organizations are trying to manage. I think collectively, I'm just going to call it the data problem, particularly with AI and figuring out how to train their models and empowering teams to really own their own data. And figuring out what that transition looks like in this tumultuous time of data really being necessary for a lot of our AI models to run. I'm curious then, you are now in this data mesh environment. I would say a leader within the data mesh community. And I'm curious how you feel your background in software engineering has actually helped influence your approach to designing data meshes, going in and consulting with folks. Because I'm not a software engineer, so I actually feel often at a distinct disadvantage in many ways.
Well, the major difference for me is that you could say I have the engineering hat on. So I not only look at a data platform as installing and configuring off-the-shelf tools and positioning that as a platform, but also thinking about the more overarching architecture or more something on top that can engineer an integrated experience on top of that. And when it comes to automating, trying to go all the way. So I'm not afraid of writing some code or putting things together. And if a small piece of software needs to be built to facilitate that, then my background will help in that. So it's really having that engineering hat on.
Well, I'm sure also, as someone who consults with this and working with engineering teams, I find that I'm distinctly disadvantaged unless I have a really good tech lead who has those skill sets of helping me push on the folks who are helping co-create a data mesh, or really any data platform. But specifically, I think those skill sets, for me, not having them put me at a distinct disadvantage because it's sometimes really hard to guide my engineers to the right resources or give them the right clues or context to build this thing. I'm often having to go back to be like, this is what will solve a user's problem, or this is what we need to deliver as self-service, which is really obviously important for data mesh. And so I'm interested in, rooted in your experience, how do you help your engineering team find those resources and upskill them because you do have so much experience in the space?
Well, in the software architecture engineering space, all those principles from domain-driven design is one area that really passionates me. And of course, there are a lot of resources around that on how to identify domains and how to subdivide your landscape in different components around what's called, for example, an aggregate. And those are all heuristics or design heuristics that are also in the data mesh journey will help. And so in that sense, there's a whole body of work concerning domain-driven design, but also how to engineer an evolutionary architecture and making sure that you don't have a one-off data platform, but that you make sure that it can evolve and that further down the road, it's not, again, a whole migration to a new platform on the side, but something that can bit by bit and piece by piece evolve.
Yeah. Would you, I'm going way off script for our questions for a moment, but I'm curious because I'm curious about the term like emergent architecture. And because you have such a strong architecture background, is that something you're always considering? I mean, you talk about the architecture needs to continuously evolve and iterate as we learn more, as you don't want to get stuck in something that's static and stale that's going to be hard to pivot or merge into something to meet the future needs. Is that sort of at the forefront of your considerations?
Well, the term is actually evolutionary architecture.
Oh.
I think there's also a great book about it, Building Evolutionary Architectures, which I recommend to read. And that really goes into, okay, what is the base component of your architecture? Where do you build in your flexibilities? In the case of a data mesh platform, for example, you want to be flexible towards using multiple data pipeline technologies or multiple data storage technologies, and maybe in future introduce another one. If you have, for example, use case that needs a graph models, then you want to introduce a graph database as a technology for an output port of a data project. So it's more that, and really, yeah, the principles behind evolutionary architecture do guide me, and that's a bit, my architecture Bible, sort of say, to make sure that the platform is future-proof.
Got it. Yeah, I think that's something that's really, really important, particularly from the product's perspective. And how do we enable teams to onboard quickly? How do we make certain that it's constantly meeting the core use of a business and its users to deliver on business outcomes that we're really after? Data to me is useless if it's not delivering on outcomes, or we're not doing something with it or drawing actionable insights from it. And that I think is really important with how we figure out how we onboard new teams to build data products into a data mesh. I think Zhamak Dehghani talks a lot about self-service a lot. And I'm curious, what are some key considerations and principles that you really kind of abide by and help your teams really manage, either novel or sort of categorized to fit sort of how you frame it with your teams?
Well, you do want to enable domain teams to self-serve to serve themselves, and let's unpack that for a bit. So it also really depends also on the persona you're targeting, and there are different ones. Have self-serve for a consumer of data products. Yeah, that implies having the ability to discover what's interesting, to understand what the data product is about, find the details, how to connect and get access, explore the data, and finally consume it and integrate it into the use case. And a lot of attention has gone to the consumers as a persona in data platforms. But in a data mesh journey, it's even more important to consider the producer of those data products as a persona, because data mesh is about decentralizing ownership, and you can only decentralize ownership if you enable that ownership. Yeah, and who takes the ownership? The producer of data products. So he or she is more concerned with the whole data product life cycle, from the inception, registration, development, building the data product, deploying it, maintaining it, and changing it over time, and also the operational parts of it. So that's another kind of self-service. And you can go even further than that. Next to the consumer and producers, there's, for example, also the governance lead. And that persona mainly wants insights in how the mesh is performing, how it's what's the state of data products being compliant with policies that are there in the organization, and so on. So there are multiple personas and stakeholders involved, and the product thinking hat is essential for this, to also design a suitable user experience for those personas, and not only for the consumer of data.
Yeah, I think I like to utilize the personas of like who produces the data, which sometimes is different than who supplies the data. Sometimes they're picking that data up. Sometimes the producers of the data are also the suppliers of data to someone else, depending on who the consuming party is. And sometimes those consuming parties are direct users who may not have a lot of technical knowledge, or like limited, or they're really just data analysts. They don't understand like the build process, versus some folks really are trying to figure out how do we take all of the nodes of our mesh and all of the information and put it in a way that's digestible to the standard business user. Putting it in dashboards and tables and connecting all that together. I'm really interested in if you had to pick one core user for a data mesh to be successful, is it more on the producer side that you would focus on, more on the supplier side, or more on the consumer side that really matters when it comes to like data mesh viability and success?
Well, I would choose the producer side. Because without any data products owned by teams, there will be no data for any other person involved. And of course, these are more technical users, or maybe even developers. Still, the user experience is important. And it's of course more than a business application which you want to design. It might also involve more technical tools, like for example, a command line interface and a plugin for your IDE, which you can use locally on your development machine, but which interacts seamlessly with the platform. And when you're creating your own data product, allows you to securely and easily, for example, connect to an upstream data product so that you can test the transformation of your data and see if it works. So for me, the producer is the key persona in a data mesh experience. And self-service, what you described earlier as of users or business users that want to serve themselves to create dashboards, that's for me is more self-service BI. And that's for data mesh, it's really a self-service on the data product as a component and a specific definition of that data product. Some call it mesh native data products, some call it pure data products. Actually, the data products that have those input and output ports are really focused on making the data itself reusable.
Yeah, I've consulted with an organization. They were a large healthcare company, or medical supplies distribution company. And one of the things that I realized was, and I'm curious if you found this, is that a lot of large legacy organizations have a hard time shifting out of the centralized data governance and data management and data ownership model where you have a CDO or a data office that kind of controls the entirety of a company's data, and moving them and getting those skill set embedded into sort of these data product teams that are really close to the folks who are actually producing the data, rather than we're producing this data, you go ahead and handle the data we're producing and get it all cleaned up and manufactured tonight. And I found that to be a really big struggle, particularly as people think about deploying this and they're so focused on the use case and the consumption of it, that I'm curious if you've seen that same challenge, and then if so, how you've overcome it.
Yeah, certainly it is a big challenge, because indeed the direct tangible value is at the consumer and the use case side. But it's more a discussion about the foundations. If you don't have the foundations right, then a lot of those use cases might also fail. And maybe sometimes when it's really difficult to convince people, it just has to fail one time to make sure that you get a leverage to talk about the foundations. But indeed, in bigger organizations, certainly when you talk to the business people, then it's more about the consumption part. And they say, okay, you data team, just handle the technical details. But what's also the case in bigger organizations is that those business units typically already have technical people and developers around for maybe the applications that they're building, or even have not the ideal situation, but they have started their own data team because the central data team can't keep up with what's needed.
No kidding. I've seen so much shadow data and IT teams, which is so interesting because there's a view from the financial organizations, often in these companies, that say, hey, you can't run shadow IT because we can't track those dollars against our capital expense or OpEx budget correctly. And you're screwing all of our accounting up, which often to me means that, well, the financials are not correctly aligned to what the moving targets of the business are. And you cite, I'm just really excited about this topic, so I apologize. We're going wildly detour here, but I think this is a really big challenge for organizations to try to overcome. And you cited failure, and like sometimes it just needs to fail. I have found, and I'm not certain if you have shared in this experience, but like when things fail, people want to double back down on what they know because now they are convinced that a new way just isn't possible for them. I'm curious if you got thoughts on like that piece. I know I've jumped from sort of, I think, technosocial failures to like the financial process of these shadow organizations that pop up out of emergent need in an organization to handle what a CDO just is no longer serving for business needs. And then on the failure side is when that starts to occur for multitudes of reasons, usually lack of investment, lack of talent, or like just not investment in the talent to get to that skill because of the financial constraints. How do you overcome that objection when the failure happens? And they're like, well, this just isn't going to work for us. We have to double down on what we have always known.
Yeah, now you're referring to the failure of maybe a new approach, but what I was thinking of is when there's a hard time convincing people that a data mesh approach is something to try, that maybe the current approach just needs another failure to have a starting point to start talking about. And on the shadow IT, it's sometimes the business units that have their own data team is no longer considered as a shadow IT because it's already done a long time, maybe. But in this case, when you want to decentralize ownership to those teams, then it can be an advantage that there is already the skills within those business units. So in that case, it can even help to get to a more decentralized ownership. But then still, if you say, okay, now we're going to decentralize the ownership, then some of them say, okay, now we can do whatever we want, and we'll continue with our own data platform. But that's then also not the intention. The intention of data mesh is to make sure that there's a shared self-service data platform, so that there's still a platform team that makes sure that those other teams don't need to build their own platforms.
Right. Because I've seen that happen too, where you now have 4 different data platforms and no one knows where stage you put their data on what platform.
Yeah, and then you get those 4 data silos.
Oh my gosh, it's terrible. I've seen that. The same company that I consulted for had three different data platforms. And they had one big one that everyone was supposed to use, but there was just, I was part of this problem to create a new one as part of like our innovation body work. And so I'm just really curious about, like, as product-minded people, one of the things I think we're constantly focused on is de-risking these platforms and data mesh products that we're putting into the ether and getting our organizations accustomed to using. And I think one of the most important skill sets from the product perspective is user research and understanding how do we make certain this is successful, de-risk the creation of the mesh, and identify what user needs we need to solve for. And I think you're right to cite production of data and the data producing teams, because I found like without that, everything else falls apart. What's the type of user research that you're often doing to assess the skill sets of those teams, what like the data is, and like what are going to be the tools and techniques that are going to best meet what those data production teams need?
It's not different from other user research. You need to get to know how your users are working today and what their pain points are, what their needs are. And yeah, there are the typical methods for that, but it's, because it's also quite a technical focus, or the users are quite technical. A lot of it also happens under the hood, and that also means that part of the product management for a platform quickly also becomes an architectural skill or task, but also the other way around. What I've also experienced is that the role of the platform architect quickly evolves to applying product management to that platform, because it's not just composing the architecture and the technical components. It's really providing capabilities and the supporting architecture to those technical users. And for example, which programming languages to support to write your data products. Yeah, that depends on what the skill sets are in those domain teams or business units on programming language. If they're all Python developers, by all means, make sure that it can be written in Python. But it can also be that there are, for example, no data engineers within a certain business unit, and that they're all software engineers writing Java. Yeah, then support that they can write their data products in Java, because that's more within their skill set. And that's the kind of research. So that's the kind of research I think you need to do, is to find out, okay, which people do we have to work with? What are the skills, and how can we make sure that to create a data product, that those skills can be used to the maximum?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I think a lot of platform product folk who don't have a lot of technical experience, and while I might be a software engineer, I think a lot about like the technical skill set that the production teams have, and I do a lot of research, usually with my tech lead, in interviewing and understanding how are people operating today. And one of the things that I've really focused on consistently is internal data work. And I admittedly haven't had a lot of experience with producing data products that are for external consumption. People outside my organization that are either purchasing this data, or we have like data sharing agreements between organizations. I've done a little bit of that, but most of the time I've been setting up a lot of internal data products. I'm curious, because in our pre-interview, you talked a little bit about the differences in designing and building a mesh for internal teams versus the ability to make that data available to external sources or external users. I'm curious if you could expand a little bit more on that, and is there a difference in your calculus when you're working to design these systems, and how the consumption model, once you get the production correct, what then do you look at on the consumption side to evaluate how best to help? I think once you get the production pieces up front, or is that really up to the data producers themselves to figure out, and agnostic of the platform? Like, where does that line for you blend?
And the question is more in terms of to what
consumption side, and like, is there a difference? I think also between like internal data consumption versus consumers external to your organization. Like, what are maybe some considerations?
Well, if the producers of the data products in your mesh are all within your own organization, and you want to make some of those data products available to external consumption, then I think the main impact is that the platform has the capability to have, for example, external security on those output ports of the data products, and also an data access request flow that goes broader than just your internal organization. So on a platform architecture level, it more has an impact, I think, on the security components, and making sure that when access is opened up to the outside world, that it's done in a secure way. But it can still be the same shared self-service platform, I think.
I'm curious then, I think one of the things that folks struggle with when it comes to like product management is the right metrics. Figuring out how to evaluate success, how to match those up to predict better business outcomes. And I'm curious from your perspective in the work that you've done in the data mesh world, are there common metrics that you're often encouraging and consulting with your clients on that really, really matter to the success of a data mesh?
Well, for that, actually, what we're doing for enabling those users is creating a platform, engineering a platform. And there's also a whole platform engineering community out there. And they have some interesting frameworks when it comes to metrics. And there are frameworks like the DORA framework, which measures what's the frequency of deployment, the lead time from a change in a data product to it being available in production in the platform, the amount of failures that happen, or the time to recover from a failure. And that's more oriented to the operational part. But there are also other frameworks like, what was it called again? Space and DevX, which focus more on measuring the developer satisfaction. Also the feedback loops, how quickly and how qualitatively is being responded to questions that are asked around the platform, but also to measure or try to measure what the cognitive load is still to be used by the producers of the data platform, the producers of the data products, to know, okay, how much technical expertise do I need to create a data product? And if that's just too high, or you can measure that over time and you can see that, okay, we started with a platform that still has a high cognitive load, but we evolved and the cognitive load went down, then that's a good indication that you're going the right way. So I would take inspiration from the frameworks that are already out there around platform engineering and try to apply them on a data tools.
I think that's really good. I'm curious. I want to click a little bit deeper into like cognitive load. Like, what do you use to measure that? Is this just like a survey of the users, or like how do you measure that?
What you could, for example, do is each data product typically also has a code base. And in an ideal world, there's very little in that code base, and a developer only needs to do small things and adapt only a few files or something to state it generally. But what is the perceived complexity of that code base? If someone says, okay, this is just way too complex, and there are 10 files in there that I never have to touch, but they're still there, then the cognitive load is still high. And that can be an indication, okay, all those 10 files that you never have to adapt, can we extract that from the code bases of the data products and put that behind the scenes and abstract it away? And then the perceived complexity of that code base will go down, and so the cognitive load will go down. So that's one example how you could try to measure that.
That's fascinating. I don't think I've looked at that before, but I think in a future, if I have to design another data mesh with a tech lead, and I was like very early in designing like and helping lead as a product manager a data mesh. I don't know if I did it successfully, to be perfectly frank. Lots of us fail at everything all the time. I think it's part of what builds good product management, but I think that's helpful to know. I'll consider that in the future. I'm interested then if you've ever had an instance where like you started down the road, as many product folk do, and you get some user feedback that just upends all of your preconceived notions about what you've been building, as far as the mesh goes, whether it's some sort of organizational complexity that wasn't accounted for, what you expected and understood and interpreted as user feedback and research, was taken the wrong direction and you had to like drastically pivot that changed your mesh approach?
That's a good question. I don't know if the example is significant, but when we did the platform in the cultural sector here in Flanders, Belgium, we actually got the insight or feedback that a lot of technical people in those cultural organizations all over the place are web developers, which have skills in, for example, PHP. And I never thought about using PHP as a transformation tech or language. But we did enable the option that you could write your data product using PHP as a language, which might seem strange. But if you have a lot of web developers out there, then having PHP or even JavaScript as a transformation code option might help in adoption of the data products. So yeah, go figure. But that was a more also a funny example, but it not significantly changed the way we designed the platform, but more about which capabilities do we provide for data product developers. Maybe another example out of that platform is that it is a platform for multiple organizations in a whole sector. So then it comes down to things you might not have thought of before, but when you want to have a unique name of a data product or even a domain, then we applied the typical reverse DNS trick to say, okay, the website of the organization, when it's, for example, cultural organization.be or something, that you take be.cultural organization and then the name of the domain or the data product, so that you can guarantee the uniqueness of the data products within the whole mesh across a lot of organizations.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I'm really interested then from the sort of multi-organizational data mesh, and you cite the sort of cultural space. Are there instances when you're building a data mesh to support multiple organizations where like the domains may overlap? Like you have organization in your case that has one domain, another like literal web domain, DNS, and another organization, but maybe they're not totally distracted from like the noun domain of like whatever they're going after. And I'm not certain about an example, but I guess I'll go back to the healthcare space. Like I might have 3 different groups that are all managing patient-specific data. And there's a view that says, well, actually, we should put all patient data into one domain, regardless of the organization, as opposed to each organization or entity having a subset of patient data. I'm curious from your perspective, when you're working with multiple organizations that kind of live within the same industry or sector that might cross the sort of common nomenclature, how do you organize that? How do you recommend organizations figure out that messy problem?
Yeah, we exactly bumped into the same problem. So in the cultural sector, there are a lot of organizations that sell tickets for cultural activities. So there are multiple organizations that are ticket vendors. So they all have data about sold tickets, and you could say, okay, the ticketing domain should be one domain. But then it becomes, okay, but we want to, what do we want to enable? We want to enable decentralized ownership. And the core of data mesh is that the experts on the data can own the source-aligned data products. So that means that what's more important is that each of those ticketing organizations can be the owner of the data product that exposes their ticketing data. So what we've seen then is that the domain boundaries, sort of say, quickly align with those organization boundaries. Because within an organization, you can still opt for a reorganization and restructure things, but you shouldn't try to start that within a sector so that multiple legal entities need to merge or do that. So that's less likely to happen, to say the least. the ownership at each organization is so relevant for that data that they have or they create. So in that sense, the domain boundaries are more becoming the organization boundaries, so that there are multiple data products within that ownership boundary.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful for product management folk, data governance folk who are trying to figure out how to construct and architect the logical layer of a data mesh. I think I mistakenly also earlier in my career, because I think I started building this data mesh early in like 2021. I can't remember the date. What was COVID time anyway? But like that was really disorienting for me, where I was taking what I thought from an internal organization of domain-driven design, where I focused on the noun itself of the thing that I'm trying to build into a product, as opposed to like, well, data ownership is really represented by the entity that owns the data. And that's got to be the first calculus. And then within that organization, I have to figure out how they're organizing the data products. And so I really love your example of utilizing like the reverse DNS stuff, or reverse DNS naming of BE, cultural institution name, data product, like now. I think that is really valuable for a lot of folk to internalize.
Within domain-driven design, there's also the option to have a domain and have subdomains in it, so that you create some kind of hierarchy on domains. And in that sense, when you have those, in the example of the different ticketing organizations with their own subdomain, it can still be part of a larger ticketing domain. That's also a way of looking at it. Just to add.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good call out. I'm curious then, when you're building a data mesh that spans multiple organizations, again, to your point, they have different skill set. Security and governance becomes crucial, because now you have data flowing across the wires, accessible. What are considerations that are really crucial in making certain that security and governance are top of mind for a multi-organization data mesh?
The first question is, of course, what will be the identity provider of such a data mesh platform? Where are the identities? And luckily for the cultural sector, the Flemish government already had a whole security infrastructure where every organization is known or can be authenticated and authorized any application, so you can integrate with that. So of course we use that one for our platform, because then we already had a solved part of it, making it possible that every organization in Belgium can authenticate on the platform. And that's like that. If that would not be there, then it would have become a bigger challenge, because then you might start your own security infrastructure, but you still need to get all those organizations in there and onboard them. While if that's already the case and they're already known, you can just piggyback on that. So that's on the security part. Maybe that's also security. It's data from multiple organizations, so there might also be a sensitivity or privacy concern involved in that. So making sure that the platform encrypts all the data and is certified to a certain extent by a governance agency that is really concerned with privacy of data. And there are processes for that, but the platform also went through that to make sure that the trust in the platform from multiple organizations is there. Because if that's not the case, why would they put their data on a platform outside their organization? So that's also an important one. And maybe on governance, and then mainly on interoperability of data. Again, in the example of the cultural sector, and even broader than the cultural sector, the Flemish government is also investing time in defining data standards and interoperability standards. And of course, we also use them. They do that using linked data and all the text that is involved in there, but it enables to kind of build a semantic web of different data standards that can be linked to each other. And of course, there are some in the cultural sector, which are then used by the data projects within the data mesh platform that we've built, so that when that data is exposed, that it's at least exposed under that standard as linked data, so that it's available for other government agencies to link towards, use it, reuse it, and make sure that the measure of data projects is interoperable. That's a bit, I think, security, privacy, and governance on interoperability.
Have you seen instances where those standards don't exist? You have to build that security platform, but maybe folks are reticent to like put everything onto one platform, and thinking of like organizations. Let's say organization A is on Google Cloud, another's on AWS, and a third organization's on Azure, for instance, and building kind of this multi-cloud, multi-organization mesh. Like, have you experienced that?
No, we haven't. The cases we have, the cases we have done is that it is a shared platform in one of those clouds, or that the data products are shared on that platform.
Well, that's helpful. As we wrap up, I'm really curious because I think product management is about learning from failure, and one of the questions that I love to ask every guest is, what's a big failure you've had in your career that you've really learned from, and just is always sort of in the back of your mind of something that you think through for every new engagement, every new project, every new consultation you're after, that just has really stuck with you?
Well, sure, everyone has come into this in the sense forgetting to talk to your users at some point in time, and just starting a project and to the best of our abilities try to build something that you think is what the users need, but still you need to talk more to your users and make sure that the users come first. And in this case, even if it's a technical platform, make sure that you also get to know the developers, the way they're working, which skills they have, which pain points they have in that organization. Because if you can fix those first, then you have a lot of buy-in from the start. So that's, I think there certainly were one or two projects in my early days that I thought, okay, we had to talk more to the users for this one, because it's not really what they need.
I think that is commonly the default failure mode of a lot of product management, just in general. They get too invested in the delivery side. And I've listened to Product Therapy by SVPG, and I just listened to an episode yesterday around time management. And one of the things that Christian Idiotti and his guests talked about was, if you look at majors and minor roles, like the major of a product manager is discovery, figuring out everything you can about your user, with a little bit of minor delivery focus that's more on like the project management administration, whereas like software engineers, your tech lead, their major is delivery, but they also need a little bit more of that discovery side, because it really is a collaborative effort. So I think that's 100% the right call out. Tom, I want to thank you so much for joining and having this conversation today. It was truly a delight and pleasure. For folks who may be interested in connecting with you, I know you're part of the Data Mesh Learning community. Where else would people be able to connect with you?
Well, the easiest way would be to use LinkedIn and connect with me.
Wonderful. We'll make certain to put that in the show notes. I want to thank you again. Again, this is the Data Product Management in Action podcast. I am Michael Toland, and thanks everyone for listening.
Thanks so much for listening. Hopefully you got some great actionable insights out of this episode. We're so excited to dig deeper into data product management and its many facets. If you want to engage more with the show, you can follow us on LinkedIn and check out Soda's website at soda.io for more related content around product management in data. And if you are a practitioner bringing product management practices to data and want to potentially be a guest, please check the show notes for a link to apply. As always, we strongly encourage people from underrepresented groups in tech to apply. Much as I'm a handsome devil, we don't want all our guests only looking like me. So again, let's get excited for more digging into data product management in action.